Welcome back, viewers, to E.G. the Virgo, and I'm going to get right into this. This is going into our next chapter for the story, which is an unusual kind, that 1%, based on actual experiences and theories. The story includes entertainment, fictional, non-fictional images, animations, videos, and music by artists and photographers, unrelated and in no way were created for this particular story and or documentary. Some names, dates, and times were changed to protect the privacy and identities of the characters within the story. Copyright disclaimer under Section 107 of the Copyright Act 1976. Allowance is made for fair use purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, and research. Fair use is a use permitted by copyright statute that might otherwise be infringing. Nonprofit, educational, or personal use tips the balance in favor of fair use. This source is at Circular 92, Copyright Law of the U.S., 17 U.S.C., Section 107. Okay, jumping right into this story here. This is Chapter 6, The Power of a Child's Wish. God hears them. And we're just going to jump right into it because I don't want to make it longer than what it actually should be. So, at the age of 7, E was now in second grade. In the 70s, elementary schools were mandated to have a teacher's aide along with the teacher in each classroom. E's second grade teacher was named Miss Allison, and the aide's name was Miss Carter. Both teachers were African American, working in a school predominantly populated with black students. In second grade, E and another little girl named Gwendolyn became best friends after they discovered through general conversations they only lived one block apart from one another. And as a result, the two walked home together after school each day ever since. Uncannily, Gwendolyn lived in the new apartment building that was built at the construction site where E, her brother, and his friend had that bad encounter with an older teenage boy who threw a boulder at E just 2 years prior. E and Gwendolyn also had the same second grade teacher named Miss Allison. E and Gwendolyn did as much as they could together while in school. They even sat next to each other at the front of the classroom closest to Miss Allison's and Miss Carter's desk. This was also during an educational era when state and federal laws required all students begin learning cursive writing in the first and second grades. E and Gwendolyn began learning cursive writing in the second grade at the same time. Each day after lunch and before recess, it was time for E's classroom to begin their cursive writing lessons. E and Gwendolyn were always excited about learning cursive writing because they felt like it would make them like grown-ups, in the sense that they would be able to write like their parents. However, both E and Gwendolyn picked up on the fact that Miss Allison had favorites in her classroom, and she was very mean and unfair to children who weren't one of her favorites. Between E and Gwendolyn, Gwendolyn was one of Miss Allison's favorite students. Gwendolyn was a little quicker in catching on as to how to write her letters in cursive. E mastered some of her letters and struggled with writing other letters in cursive. All the children had different learning curves. One day, during their cursive writing lessons, Mrs. Allison and Miss Carter were both standing in the front of the class, eating from a family-sized bag of potato chips while the class quietly worked on their cursive writing assignment. Knowing most of the children in the class couldn't concentrate from watching them eat one of America's best junk foods in their faces without offering them any, Mrs. Allison or Miss Allison decided she would give chips to all the students she thought had the better handwritten cursive letters. Of course, in Miss Allison's opinion, only her favorite students had the best handwriting and would be one of the ones she gave some potato chips to. As Miss Allison went around the entire classroom giving out chips to her favorite students, other students, like E, began feeling bad, disinterested, demotivated, and devalued in their efforts to learn or better themselves in cursive writing. Some students slowly began to misbehave and disrupt the class as time went on. But E just looked over at Gwendolyn's cursive writing practice paper and then looked back at her own in shame, not realizing she didn't have to feel shame because her cursive writing was just as good as anyone else's. E saw that not only was Gwendolyn further ahead in their writing assignment, but E had to admit Gwendolyn's cursive writing was pretty good for a second grader. Although E's cursive writing was coming along just fine, she wasn't up to the speed and accuracy of Gwendolyn. When Mrs. Allison gave some chips to Gwendolyn, Gwendolyn smiled and thanked Miss Allison. When E looked up at Miss Allison to see if she would get some chips, Miss Allison didn't even acknowledge E's efforts and went back to her desk at the front of the classroom and continued eating chips from her own bag. When Miss Allison ignored E's efforts in writing, E sadly looked over at Gwendolyn happily eating her chips and then turned back to her own desk and sadly hung her head. Although E continued with the writing assignment, E didn't feel as motivated. E felt like she must be stupid compared to Gwendolyn. Gwendolyn noticed E looked sad and offered E 3 of her potato chips. And when E accepted the offer, Miss Allison heard Gwendolyn and yelled out, "Do not give E anything until I say she has earned it." Gwendolyn sadly looked at E and said sorry to E for not being able to share her chips with her. Miss Carter, who was very observant and usually the peacemaker, noticed what Miss Allison had done and how some of the children's attitudes changed in the classroom when they didn't get any chips. And as a result, Miss Carter offered an alternative resolution to Miss Allison's unfair incentive. Miss Carter clapped her hands 2 times to get the attention of the students in the classroom. After immediately getting the students' attention, Miss Carter proudly announced that anyone who didn't get any chips can get a bundle of chips whenever they finish the assignment, and those who can't finish, she would go around the classroom and help them finish so they can have some chips too. The moods of the children instantly changed to motivation and happiness. Children who didn't get chips from Miss Allison voiced praise for Miss Carter's idea, clapped their hands while still sitting at their desks, anxiously, happily, and enthusiastically, immediately got back to working on their assignment. There were no further class disruptions from anyone or any of the students after Mrs. Carter's announcement. Miss Allison's facial expression and mean, glaring eyes showed her disapproval of Miss Carter's fair and alternative offer and Gwendolyn's attempt to share her chips with E. The next day, Miss Allison had something more horrible in mind for the children who weren't her favorite. During the next writing lesson, the assignment called for the kids to try to connect 2 to 3 letter words together in cursive, with the first letter of each word being capitalized. While all the kids were putting their best effort forward, both Miss Allison and Miss Carter were walking around the classroom to see how the students were doing and to assist those who may need some help. Miss Allison got to Gwendolyn and voiced praise for her efforts. E smiled at Gwendolyn and congratulating her, and then looked up at Miss Allison for approval or comment as to how she was doing. Miss Allison looked down at E's paper and firmly said to her, "If you look up at me again instead of keeping your eyes on your paper, I'm going to crack your knuckles with my ruler." After being embarrassed and humiliated in front of the entire class, E quietly resumed her writing assignment. E could see Gwendolyn looking at her and Miss Allison with confusion. As Miss Allison moved towards the back of the class, Miss Carter was moving towards the front of the class where E and Gwendolyn sat. Miss Carter complimented both E and Gwendolyn on their writing efforts. Afterwards, Miss Carter stepped out of the classroom for a bathroom break. Miss Allison moved back to the front of the class, looked at Gwendolyn, smiled, and said, "You are such a smart and pretty little girl, and you should have friends that are smart and pretty just like you." Gwendolyn smiled out of respect and remarked she did have a best friend just like her, and she pointed to E. Miss Allison quickly and nicely told Gwendolyn, "Shh, no talking, please." Miss Allison didn't even acknowledge Gwendolyn's comment about E being her best friend, who she felt was just like her, friendly, smart, fun, and fair. Momentarily distracted from her work due to the discussion Miss Allison was having with Gwendolyn, E briefly glanced up at Gwendolyn and Miss Allison and then went back to working on her paper. Without warning and not expecting a thing, Miss Allison cracked E's knuckles and scolded her by saying, "Didn't I tell you not to look up at me anymore?" Gwendolyn and other kids who sat nearby jumped in shock, then quietly looked over at E, whose eyes began filling up with tears as she held her right hand that was hurting and then put her head in her arms down on her desk out of pain and embarrassment as she quietly cried. E didn't finish her paper before others because E's right-handed, and it hurt for E to continue writing with her right hand. By this time, Miss Carter returned to the classroom and saw E with her head down. Miss Carter went over to E and asked what was wrong and why she was crying. But before E could answer Miss Carter's question, Miss Allison answered for E and said E needed to learn to keep her eyes on her own paper and not worry about what everyone else was doing. Miss Allison continued by stating now she's the only one not finished her assignment and therefore would be missing the afternoon recess. Miss Carter gently held E by her left hand and walked E over to her teacher's desk so she could give E a tissue to wipe her tears. Miss Carter then caringly rubbed E's shoulder and told E it would be okay and that she would help E finish her work if E needed the help. Miss Carter then walked E back to her desk and asked E to do her best, and she would check her work again after recess. E calmly and sadly sat back down at her desk and began trying to finish her work as Miss Carter asked her to do. Without even looking up from her paper, E could hear the other children lining up to the classroom door, preparing to exit to the playground for recess. Within seconds, the classroom was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. There was only E and Miss Allison in the classroom. It came to a point where E needed help, but didn't want to ask Miss Allison, so E stalled around, hoping time would fly by and Miss Carter and the kids would come back from the afternoon recess real soon. E began erasing words that she had done correctly so that she could rewrite them again. Miss Allison noticed E was erasing and went over to E and asked why she was erasing so much. E looked up to tell Miss Allison she wanted to make her cursive letters better, but before she could actually finish her sentence, Miss Allison cracked her on her knuckles again on the same right hand. E softly yelped out in pain, grabbing and holding her right hand again. Again, E's eyes swelled with tears. Miss Allison then yelled at E and told E she better be done her paperwork and before recess was over. Finally, E couldn't take it anymore and asked Miss Allison for a bathroom pass. Miss Allison reluctantly gave E a bathroom pass. E left the classroom and stayed in the bathroom until recess was over. Recess ended 5 minutes later, and E headed back to the classroom. The students were getting resettled back in their seats, and Miss Carter walked over to see E and how she was doing with her assignment. At this time, Miss Allison was busy instructing the class on a new assignment for that day. Miss Carter pulled a chair up next to E's desk to begin helping E finish her work. When E began trying to write, Miss Carter saw E's knuckles were red and E's hand was trembling. Miss Carter gently took E by the hand and told E to walk with her to the bathroom. Miss Allison looked stern at them both as Miss Carter and E left the classroom. Once E and Miss Carter got to the bathroom, Miss Carter began running cold water on E's right hand. Miss Carter then told E to be sure to go straight home after school to show and tell her mother what happened and not to forget. Also, because she knew E's hand was hurting too bad for E to continue writing with, Miss Carter had snuck E's writing paper out of the classroom when they left to go to the bathroom, and she finished E's paper for her by doing her best to try to write as E would have written her own cursive letters. After they returned to the class, Miss Carter waited about 10 minutes before she went back to E's desk. When she returned to E's desk, Miss Carter loudly said, "Great job, E. You're all finished." Miss Carter then took E's paper and put it on Miss Allison's desk with the other kids' writing papers, and then helped E catch up with the new assignment the rest of the students were already working on. An hour later, the bell rang and school was out for the day, and all the kids in the school happily headed home. There were no school buses, so all the kids walked home. As E and Gwendolyn walked home, they talked about everything that happened, and Gwendolyn said she hated Miss Allison and that she was going home and tell her own mother what Miss Allison did to E. And then Gwendolyn told E she should tell her mom too. E said that she would and that her mom was going to be very mad about what happened. E then said she wished Miss Allison would never come back to school again. As promised, when E got home, she told her mother everything, but when she went to show her mother her bruises on her knuckles, they weren't as red as they were a couple hours prior. Nevertheless, E's mother was still very upset at what E told her about Miss Allison hitting her twice with a ruler and making her hand red. E's mother told her if Miss Allison hits her again, she wanted E to immediately get up from her desk, walk out of the classroom, and come straight home and tell her. And of course, as luck would have it, the next day in school, Miss Allison cracked E's knuckles again, and before either teacher noticed E had left the classroom, E did just what her mother told her. E immediately left the school during school hours and walked home. This time, E's mother was clearly able to see the redness on E's knuckles, E's trembling hand, and saw the dried up tears on her face. E's mother immediately got in the car along with E and drove up to the school within 15 minutes of E getting home. E's mother took E to the Principal Briggs' office, actually to Principal Briggs' office, showed her E's hand, and expressed to her anger and threatened a lawsuit against the school for physical child abuse and emotional damage. E's mother then told Miss Briggs why she told E to walk out and come home if it happened again. This way, E's mother would have fresh proof that the teacher was inflicting bodily harm on E, and no one could say that E was dishonest. In utter shock and disbelief, Miss Briggs immediately walked down to the classroom with E's mother because E's mother was already headed to the classroom. Miss Briggs knew how mothers felt about someone abusing their child, and Miss Briggs didn't want any physical confrontations to take place in the school in front of the children and E. So Miss Briggs immediately and quickly followed suit to E's classroom. Miss Briggs hurried to get in front of E's mother so she could get to the classroom before E's mother. Miss Briggs also didn't want this kind of serious matter getting back to the school superintendent and other parents and wanted to make sure this matter was resolved immediately. Miss Briggs opened the classroom door and asked Miss Allison to step outside the classroom into the hallway and nicely advised E to go into the classroom and see Miss Carter about the current lesson the kids were working on. Miss Carter could see exactly what was going on. She looked down at E, smiled, and then gently guided E to the back of the classroom where the rest of the children were having reading time in a circle. Gwendolyn was very excited to see E back, smiling and happy. But because the class could hear the loud, angry, and threatening voice of E's mother, Miss Carter asked the kids to begin singing a song as loud as they could so E and the other children couldn't hear or wonder about what was taking place just outside their classroom door in the hallway. About 10 minutes later, Miss Allison abruptly stormed back into the classroom and without looking at anyone, grabbed her pocketbook, suit jacket, and hastily left. Miss Allison never returned for the rest of that day. Miss Allison was immediately placed on investigative suspension. After Miss Allison left the classroom, Miss Briggs went over to E and told E she thought she was a beautiful, bright little girl and that she had the prettiest eyes that she ever saw. E looked up at Miss Briggs, smiled, and sweetly said thank you. Miss Briggs then quietly asked Miss Carter if she would be okay running the classroom for the rest of the day while Miss Briggs looked for a substitute teacher to come in the next day to fill in for Miss Allison. Miss Carter happily accepted. But because Miss Briggs put Miss Allison on investigative suspension, Miss Briggs had to provide a full, detailed written report to the school superintendent explaining her actions towards Miss Allison. The superintendent agreed with Miss Briggs' actions and immediately went to the school the very next day and spent an entire week there setting up teacher and aide meetings for preventive training classes for all teachers and aides in that entire school district. Meanwhile, Miss Allison had hired an attorney to help fight her case so she could return to school for work. That following week was Easter vacation for the kids. As the school board and union got involved in the case, Miss Allison had a stroke during Easter break and was never able to return to work again anywhere. Her stroke left her unable to work for the rest of her life. Due to Miss Allison's permanent medical condition, her case against the school was dropped and closed. And because it was almost the end of the school year and summer was fast approaching, Miss Briggs felt Miss Carter should be okay with running the class alone for the last couple of months of school. Again, Miss Carter happily accepted, and Miss Briggs told Miss Carter that she would receive a temporary pay increase equivalent to a teacher's salary through the end of the school year. Further, Miss Briggs advised Miss Carter if she ever needed help in the classroom with anything to just buzz her office from the classroom phone and she would be there immediately. This was a good day for Miss Carter, the kids in E's classroom, and of course, the best day ever for E, especially since E's wish of wishing Miss Allison would never come back to school again uncannily came true. The power of a child's wish. And you know, Miss Allison had done a few other kids wrong, in the past years. She had done them wrong too. So E wasn't the only one that she was being unfair to and physically abusive towards. So that she wasn't the first one. So she pretty much, I would say, got what she deserved. And of course, her dismissal and not coming back to school was called for a big celebration of the kids. The kids were really happy that Miss Allison was not coming back. And she could not only come back to them, but she wouldn't come back to any students ever again. And that brings us to the end of chapter 6, The Power of a Child's Wish. God hears them. You know, we have to really look at how Eve's wish, what is what she called it, children, actually came true. What a wish can be a prayer as well. And when you know, I personally believe if there are actually God's children and then God's chosen children. Because it seems like if you do something wrong to those chosen children, you will reap what you sow. Like karma never had it. You know what I mean? Like it would be like you never expected something like that to come back like that. But it did. And you have to look at it again. And this was the uniqueness in E, how, you know, she was being treated so bad by her teacher, and then her teacher, you know, it's an unfortunate thing, a stroke is, but was stricken with the stroke condition for even, I don't know what she did, but I'm certain it had something to do with how she was treating E and children before E. So with that being said, we're going to end this on a good note until we get to the next chapter, which is chapter 7, which is when E first notices something. So until then, viewers and readers, and again, anyone who just wanted to pause it, just pause and read through it yourself. And I hope you can see how all of this is coming together with this story documentary. And like I said, these chapters go on, and right now we're still in volume 1. But these are true and honest experiences and stories of E as she has progressed through life. And it went all the way back to her grandparents, to her parents, on to her. So it's showing you how sometimes life has a direct connect to you. Or people would say you have a direct connect to God. But somehow, when you see all this happening, you will look back in your past, or you will look at another child's challenges, and you would hopefully think like, you know, wow, this child, is this person or child one of those children of God? I mean, are they one of his chosen children versus his children? Because we're all his children. But then you have those that are his actual chosen children. That's the way I see it. But when this moves on, you will see how E, this little girl, gets through life. It's pretty interesting, I think, once it gets to rolling and we get these chapters up. And you might just be able to read all the way from chapter 1 on down to whatever chapter I stopped at last. And until then, we'll be talking, and you all have a good evening. I hope you all enjoyed your July 4th Independence Day weekend. And good night, good day, whichever time you're listening to it. I bid you all a good one.